lecture, we're going to discuss the tissues of the human body. We're going to learn the different categories and classification of these tissues. You're going to learn to be able to identify what type of tissue you're looking at by just looking at a slide under the microscope. That's the field of histology. And we're going to talk about the structure and functions of these different types of tissues. So let's get started. Now, you're probably already familiar with the organization of humans and other organisms. You might have learned about the chemical basis for life, that there are atoms, and those atoms get put together in different combinations to make molecules and compounds. And ultimately, for life, those compounds are able to come together to make the basic unit of life, the cell. Now, when those cells come together and start communicating with each other and working together, we have what are called tissues. So we can define tissue as a group of cells performing similar functions. And they tend to congregate together in things like organs. So for example, if you had a liver and you took a slice of it and looked under a microscope, you would see a lot of cells. Some of them have variable structure and function, but all of them work together through communication to perform the ultimate function of the organ. And then of course, those organs come together to make organ systems and eventually have the organism itself. In addition to having variable structure and function, these different tissues and even the cells that make them up, you might be surrounded by different types of extracellular matrix, which is the stuff around the cells, and we'll talk more about that later. And check out these pictures of some examples of different kinds of tissues you would find in the human body. So take a look at how variable they are, these different types of tissues, and in fact, they are variable in terms of their function. So a goal of this lecture is by the time you're done studying our lecture on tissues, you'll be able to look at one of these and say, oh, I know what that is. And not just what type of tissue it is, but where it's found in the human body. And zooming in, looking up close, you'll be able to identify the different types of cell layers and cells that you're looking at in different areas of the tissue. And that might even give clues as to where in the body you might be looking at. So let's get started, and we're going to take these different types of tissues and break them into 4 overarching categories. Now, the fun of studying tissues is that there are a lot of subcategories, and we'll be going over those too. But to start, let's just say 4 main categories that we're going to put all the tissues of the human body into. And so these are going to be epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So epithelial tissue is what we're going to spend the most time of because it has so many different subcategories, and it also is found in so many different places in the body, from the covering of something like the inside of your cheek to the coverings of organs. It comes in many shapes and sizes. So this little chart right here is going to be a nice summary of the different types of tissue of the human body. So epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. So we're going to spend a lot of time breaking each of these down and getting you familiar with the histology so that you can identify these. Now, one of the things we're going to do in this lecture is make use of a wonderful, amazing software from McGraw-Hill Publishers called AP Revealed. And that's a virtual cadaver dissection software, but it has a great unit on different kinds of tissues, and we'll be able to actually look up close, especially at the histology, which will help you to learn these different types of tissues. Now, the moral of the story when we're studying tissues is that the function of the tissues, tissue function, equals the physiology of the organ. So you might remember that we always say form follows function and function follows form. So in other words, the function of an organ is going to be dependent on its structure. And likewise, the structure is going to evolve based on the kind of function that's needed. But going with the former, that function follows form, that's kind of what we're getting at here, that the way an organ is going to act, the way it's going to function is dependent on its structure, and that structure is the tissue. So this is a very important concept when you're studying anatomy and physiology, that function follows form. So the first of those 4 categories we're going to tackle is epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue, epi means upon, right? So this is the tissue that lines all body surfaces, all cavities of the body. And with respect to organs, it's going to line the outside of the organs, both inside and outside. So it's everywhere. And as I had mentioned, there's many subcategories of it, but you're going to learn to identify those subcategories and look at a slide and be able to identify what kind of epithelial tissue you're looking at, as well as understanding the different little structures making up that tissue. Even most glands, so whether you're talking about sweat glands or oil glands, these guys are all derived from epithelial tissue. So in our conversation of epithelial tissue, we'll be talking about glands as well. So just as epithelial is diverse in terms of its structures as it's found in the human body, it's also diverse in terms of its functions. So epithelial tissue can take on a whole bunch of different functions in the body. So for example, you meet the first bit of epithelial tissue when you're talking about your skin. And the purpose of skin is physical protection. So the skin is what makes up the integumentary system, which we'll be getting into in a future lecture. But no matter what, that skin and the epithelial tissue that makes it up has the purpose of physical protection. So it's our first barrier from bacteria or viruses getting into our body or problems with the environment such as heat. So epithelial tissue, not just with the skin, but with all sorts of things, acts for physical protection. If you think about the organs, you remember learning about the visceral membrane surrounding the organs. Well, those are made of tissue, epithelial tissue, and that tissue is going to help protect the organs, preventing, for example, friction if two organs rub up against each other. Also, epithelial tissue has the function that it has selective permeability. In other words, because it's made up of cells, and those cells have different regions to them, which we'll talk about in a minute, that allows certain things to come into the cells and therefore into the tissue layer and therefore into the organ, and other things to be kept out. So because those cells have cell membranes, you might have remembered learning about cell membranes being selectively permeable. That's going to determine which kinds of molecules can come in, which can go out, and what cannot go in or out. So they have the function of selective permeability. Epithelial tissue is also capable of secretions. So we're going to learn about some of the glands that you'll find around epithelial tissue. For example, sweat is a secretion of glands of the epithelial tissue. Oil from sebaceous glands, that's part of the epithelial tissue as well. So we're going to be learning about that function of some epithelial tissue. And another function is sensations. So for example, if you get cold or scared, you might witness hairs standing up on your skin. So those are sticking right out of the epithelial tissue and provide sensations such as touch. So we'll be keeping an eye out for these different functions as we talk about some of these different epithelial tissues. So let's talk about some of the characteristics that all epithelial tissue have in common. So number one, epithelial tissue, the cells of the epithelial tissue have what's called an apical surface. This means the top. So if we look at this diagram here, we see some cells, some epithelial cells. Together they're called the epithelium. And you see that there's different sides to these cells. So up at the top, the side that faces the external environment or perhaps faces the extracellular matrix, faces away from the organ, that would be called the apical surface. And that whole area would be the apical region. So if you look at one epithelial cell here, this would be the apical region of the epithelial cell. Now, they also, in addition to having sort of an apical top surface or area, they also have a basal surface. So you could think of basal meaning like below. Below and basal both start with B. Or you could think of basement. So it kind of sounds similar too. So this would be the basal region of this epithelium. So we'll get into more detail about this, but just know for now that epithelial cells kind of have a top and they have a bottom. They have an apical region and they have a basal surface. Over here, you see a scanning electron micrograph of epithelial cells. And you can see here would be the apical surface over here. And the basal surface in this case has gotten cut off in the picture. Also, epithelial tissue is avascular. That means it doesn't have any going directly through it. So if you look at the diagram here, so this is the epithelium, the actual cells. Below that epithelium, below the cells, is where you get into that other kind of tissue we talked about, connective tissue. And that's where you have the vascularity, the capillaries going through, and the nerve cells. But the actual epithelium itself, avascular, there's no blood vessels there. And another characteristic of epithelial tissue is it regenerates fat. In other words, if you get rid of some of those cells, they're going to grow back very quickly, or if they get damaged, they're going to grow back very quickly. And this is important because remember that protective function of epithelium means that these guys are constantly facing stress. And so it's going to be important that they are able to regenerate themselves quickly to repair all the damage and loss that is occurring. Now, you saw that an epithelial layer consists of cells lined up side by side like soldiers. So they're right next to each other. Now, sometimes you want things to be able to pass back and forth between the lateral surfaces, i.e. the sides of the cells, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you need those cells to just kind of help each other out, reinforce each other when the tissue is under stress. And so cells have evolved to use certain protein structures to either bridge the gap between two cells that are next to each other, or to hold them tight so that nothing can get through. So let's talk about some of these different types of intercellular junctions that epithelial cells have to regulate what can go in or out of the sides, the lateral surfaces of the cells. So there are three overarching categories of junctions: tight junctions, adhering junctions, and gap junctions. So let's take a closer look at some of these. And you see down here some actual cells, and they've been dyed here with some fluorescent dye, and so you can see some highlights of some of these junctions. So let's start off with tight junctions. So tight junctions are there so that certain types of epithelial cells are going to be bound together so tightly by protein structures that nothing can get from one cell to the other or back again. So if you have the plasma membrane of the lateral side of one cell over here and the plasma membrane of the lateral side right here, you have these little protein structures here, these tight junction proteins, and they are going to hold the thing so tight, nothing's going to get through there. So that's one type of junction. That's when you don't want anything going between the cells. Adhesion junctions are another category, and you can see here that the gap is there. There's a little bit of a gap. They're not held quite as tightly as they are in a tight junction. And in fact, what you get here is what's called a cytoplasmic plaque forming on the cell surface here, on the cell membrane on either side. And going between them are different types of proteins called filaments. And these guys are going to bridge the gap between the plaques. And so this allows these cells to stay connected without barring things completely from being able to get on either side there. So these have a function, especially in tissues that are under constant stress. So think of the bladder or the stomach, where that tissue is being stretched. This makes sure that these guys don't get away from each other, and that they kind of sort of form a tissue that has some connection to it. And finally, we have our gap junction here. And gap junctions really have a function of communication between these cells that are lined up next to each other. So you can see here, we're still dealing with proteins, but these proteins have channels through them. So they have kind of little tunnels, and that allows things like ions to go from one cell to the other. So they really serve a communication function between the cells. So let's recap what we've just been studying about the general structure of epithelium, the connections between the cells, and the form and functions of epithelial tissue. So we're going to use McGraw-Hill's wonderful Anatomy and Physiology Revealed, or AP Revealed software. And again, this is virtual cadaver dissections. It lets you watch videos. It lets you quiz yourself and study the histology. I think it is just one of the best ways, personally, to study anatomy and physiology. So from the main menu here, and you can get to AP Revealed through this website, where it says module, I'm going to pull that down and select tissues. That takes us to the tissues module. And from there, you can see that you could pull down this menu here, and we'll be able to go through all the different kinds of categories of epithelial tissue that we are going to be talking about. So we'll get to this in a little bit, but for now, I just want to watch a little bit of a video that's going to recap of what we've said so far. So if I click this link up here, this is for animations. You'll see there's several animations associated with tissues. I'm going to click on Epithelial Tissue Overview, and let's watch for a little bit.
Epithelia form the surface layer of the body, line body cavities, hollow organs, and structures, and constitute most gland tissue. Any substance that enters or leaves the body must cross an epithelium. All epithelia consist of one or more layers of tightly packed cells and little or no extracellular matrix between cells. Distinguishing features of an epithelium include a free apical surface and a fixed basal surface. Specialized intercellular junctions join adjacent cells, and a thin basement membrane separates the basal surface from underlying connective tissue layers. Although epithelia lack blood vessels, many sensory nerve endings are present. Epithelia have a high regenerative capacity that allows them to maintain their function. The primary functions of an epithelium are to resist dehydration and injury from physical, chemical, and biological agents, to selectively regulate materials entering and leaving the body, to secrete products produced by epithelial glands, and to monitor the environment through specialized sensory nerve endings and specialized epithelial cells.
So now we're ready to go over the different types of epithelial tissues. So the different types of epithelial tissue layers. So let's get started, and when we're done, we will go back to AP Revealed software and practice. So the most simple kind of epithelial tissue layer is called simple epithelium. It's only one cell layer thick. So this is very simple. You see some examples of this. So here you can see how these cells are just one layer thick. Or here you have different shapes, which we'll talk about the shapes of epithelial cells in a second. But again, you can see they're all lined up along the basal layer there. So they're not on top of each other, just lined up, all touching that basal layer. Same here. You see basically a photograph of the same kind of tissue layer you see there. And these column-shaped cells are just all next to each other, but all of them are touching that basal layer. So that is called simple epithelium. Now, if you start stacking these guys on top of each other, then we have what's called stratified epithelium, so multiple layers of cells. And these are often found in parts of the body that require protection. So take a look at this layer here. So you can see these are the nuclei of the cells. And so when you see that the nuclei are scattered about and sort of on top of each other, you know that you're looking at some stratified epithelial cells. And then we have a type that this is the one that people seem to struggle the most with, and that is what is called pseudostratified epithelium. And it's pseudostratified because in actuality, if you look at all of these different cells and follow their cell bodies, you'll see that all of them do in fact touch the basal layer. But some are squished and elongated, and that makes them look like their nuclei are on top of each other. But if you were to look closely, you'd actually see that all of them are just squeezed next to each other with a basal layer there. They're all touching that basal layer. So single layer, but not all the cells reach the apical surface, but they all do hit the basal surface. And so therefore the nuclei give the appearance of being multi-layered and stratified when in fact they are actually not. So we have simple epithelium, all one layer, all touching the basal surface. Stratified, multiple layers, they're not all touching the basal surface. And pseudostratified, where in fact they all are touching the basal surface, but don't look that way. They look like they're stratified even though they're not. So we just went over one kind of classification of epithelial tissue. So either simple, stratified, or pseudostratified epithelial tissue. But when you're categorizing epithelial tissue, you also need to categorize the shape of the cells that are in that layer. So there are three cell shapes that you'll encounter in epithelial tissue: squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. So squamous, think of like squatting. Squamous refers to flat. So squamous epithelial cells are flattened cells. And so you can see these right here. So you see how these cells, while they're next to each other, they're also kind of squashed down. They're flat. So that's squamous epithelial cells. And then ones that are a little more boxy, I won't say they're perfect squares, but they're boxier than what you see in the squamous or in the columnar. These are called cuboidal cells. So they're somewhat cube shaped. So you can see these are cross sections through some glands. And so you'll see that these are lined with cuboidal cells. So here would be the basement membrane, and here's the nucleus of each cell. And you can see that the cells are kind of cuboidal in shape. Here's another picture of them. They're kind of cool. And then finally, cells that are elongated and kind of rectangular in shape, these are called columnar cells. So they tend to be very tall. And check out these right here. So you see here's the basement membrane, and each cell is somewhat column shaped. It's elongated. They're very tall. And often tissues that have columnar cells will be embedded with a special kind of cell called a goblet cell, because it kind of looks like a wine goblet. And these are cells that produce mucin or mucus. So pretty cool. You'll see they're kind of transparent. You see in this photograph here, here's goblet cell surrounded by columnar cells. A lot of times these columnar cells will have cilia attached to the apical side. So that helps to, brush debris away, for example. So 3 shapes to epithelial tissue: squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. And so when you're categorizing epithelial tissue, what we want to do is take the description of how many layers it is. Is it simple? Is it stratified? Or is it pseudostratified? And add to that the shape of the cells. So for example, right, what you're looking at here would be simple because it's 1 cell layer thick, cuboidal because it's cube shaped, epithelial tissue. So simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. This would be simple squamous epithelial tissue because you can see these are 1 cell layer thick and they're those flattened cells. So that would be simple squamous. And over here, this happens to be simple columnar epithelial tissue because they're all touching the basal surface. So they're 1 cell layer thick and they're column shaped. So simple columnar epithelium. There's yet another kind of epithelium which you find inside of the urinary bladder. And this is called transitional epithelium because the cells of the urinary bladder, the cells of the transitional epithelium, are constantly being stretched, right? When your bladder is full, these cells are going to stretch, and that causes them to become flatter, more squamous. And when they're not stretched out, they're kind of snapping back, and they can take on a more cuboidal shape. So this is an epithelium that changes shape from squamous to cuboidal and back again. So if the bladder wall is stretched because the bladder's full, it'll be squamous. And if it's empty, then the wall will be contracted and it'll be cuboidal. So you can kind of take some looks at the histology here. So over here you can see the basal membrane or the basement membrane, and you see all these cells kind of on top of each other. And over here, you can see sort of the diagram of that. So here's a photograph under just a light microscope of simple squamous epithelium. So you're looking down from the top at this tissue layer, and you can just see they are flat. You can see a nucleus inside each one of these flattened cells, and they're all in 1 layer. So this is simple squamous. Here's another look at simple squamous tissue. So kind of more looking at the sides here. This is from inside the lungs, and you can see that the alveoli of the lungs are lined with simple squamous epithelial tissue. So you can see these flattened cells just all 1 layer thick here. Here's a picture of stratified squamous epithelium, and you can see that because here's the basal layer here, or also called the basement membrane. Got the connective tissue down here, and all these guys are just piling on top of each other. So the cells up here are in a completely different layer than the ones below them. And so you have multiple layers of these squamous cells. So this is stratified squamous epithelium. You guessed it, simple columnar. These guys are all touching the basal membrane here. They each have 1 nucleus and they're column shaped, and you can even see the cilia at the apical surface. So lined up like good soldiers, these guys are simple columnar epithelium. And here's that pseudostratified epithelium that we talked about. So in this case, we locate the basement membrane. And if you look, this cell is touching the basement membrane. This one is 2. This one actually is 2 if you follow it all the way down. So any of them that you look at, if you follow it down enough, even though they might be really squashed, they're still all touching that basal membrane there. Even though they look like they're on top of each other, they're really not. So this is called pseudostratified, and they're column shaped, so columnar epithelium. And specifically, because these have cilia at the apical surface, the technical term for this slide here, for this tissue, is ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. That's a mouthful. Simple cuboidal, so cells all one cell layer thick and cube shape with a big old nucleus in each one. Here's a stratified cuboidal. So you can see here that these guys are definitely in multiple layers and they are cube shaped. So this is stratified cuboidal epithelium. Okay, so let's go back to our McGraw-Hill Publishers AP Revealed software so we can practice the identification of the different categories of tissues that we just did. So again, we go back to modules, select module, and we're going to click on tissues. And this time I'm going to click on the little microscope up here, which is for histology, so that we can get to looking at some actual microscope graphs or microscopic pictures of these different tissues so we can identify them. So under microscope, I'm going to pull for topics. You can see that they're all listed here, and we've been talking about epithelial tissue. So we said that the different categories are simple squamous epithelium, simple cuboidal epithelium, simple columnar epithelium, ciliated or non-ciliated, and pseudostratified columnar epithelium. We also said that there is stratified squamous epithelium, and it can be keratinized or non-keratinized, and you'll see what we mean in a minute. Stratified cuboidal epithelium, stratified columnar epithelium, and transitional epithelium. And then we'll get to connective tissues and muscle and blood and stuff like that later on. So let's start with simple squamous epithelium. So I'm going to click there. So here's a nice micrograph of simple squamous epithelium, and you can see that this is under medium power magnification. Now, if you go down here to the bottom where it says tags, I can click that and it'll tag some important features that I want you to know about simple squamous epithelium. So let's just start up here. So you can either hover over here and this will say, okay, that's a nucleus of a squamous cell, or you can actually click it and it'll turn it blue here. So you can see that you can identify the nuclei of these simple squamous epithelium here. Let's see, this is just going to say that whole layer here is one layer of simple squamous epithelium. If we go down here, we actually see down here is not squamous epithelium, that is cuboidal epithelium. So if I click here, you can see that's a nucleus of one of those cuboidal cells. This is just the whole cell, showing you one cuboidal cell. And over here, you can see the whole layer of simple cuboidal epithelium. So notice that on the same micrograph, we have two types of epithelial tissue layers here. We have the simple cuboidal and we have a simple squamous up there. So very important to know. And you'll notice that they also have tagged here that this is just some connective tissue, which we'll get into in a little bit. So one of the other things that this software does is it gives you information about what you're looking at. So notice that because we highlighted the entire layer of simple squamous epithelium here, it'll tell you a little bit about it. So for this particular micrograph, that simple squamous epithelium is from the lining of the alveoli and the lungs. And you saw in the PowerPoint that we talked, I showed you a slide that actually was that. But this also tells you other locations in the body where you would find simple squamous epithelium. So notice it says in the endothelium, so the lumen of blood and lymphatic vessels and heart chambers. So for example, going on the lining of the lymphatic vessels, or the mesothelium, so serous membranes lining the body cavities. So as you're studying these different layers, epithelial tissues, you want to make sure you can give examples of where in the body you would find those. But again, description, single layer of flat, irregularly shaped cells, a central flattened nucleus, some of the functions. This helps with diffusion of things across the membrane, filtration, secretion. And so anyway, you can see that you can gain a lot of information from here. You can also even get it pronounced if you want.
Simple squamous epithelium.
Or down here, if I highlight the whole cuboidal epithelial layer.
Simple cuboidal epithelium.
And you'll see that some characteristics you can read about there. So anyway, you can also, this will give you some other views of it. So here's a more simple cuboidal epithelium. So it's just a different view of it. And if you go, let's go back a little bit here. And if I click here, we're back to an animation that we can. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back. We think you know what simple squamous epithelium is, and we did talk about simple cuboidal epithelium. So I think we're okay on that. Here's just some more representations of that. Let's go on down to the columnars, talking about the ciliated columnar epithelium. And so you can see here some tissues, and this will give you a lot of the different characteristics that we should know about what we're seeing here. So let's start with that basement membrane, also called the basal membrane. So if you click that, it will highlight the basal membranes in some of these different tissues here. And so that really gives you a nice visual so you can see where the epithelial layer stops. Click here, it highlights the cilia that are at the apical surface of these columnar cells. Here it just says, okay, here's a columnar cell. Notice it goes down to that basal membrane, and here's the apical surface and the cilia. What you see here, because these are ducts that have been cross-sectioned, and you see space in the middle of that simple columnar epithelium. And that is called the lamina propria of the simple columnar epithelium. Lamina propria. If you click here, this is the lumen of the uterine tube. So lumen means space. So this is the space between these different parts of the epithelial tissue. And so we happen to be inside the uterus right now, the uterine tube. And so these are the lumen, or the space between these different layers here. You can click on the nucleus of one of these cells. And you can see the whole cell right there. And here it'll just highlight for you the entire simple columnar epithelium. So pretty cool. And then if you wanted to quiz yourself, just click the tags. And this one is called a peg cell. Here's the nucleus of one of these. Here's the whole cell. Here's the cilia, etc. So you can quiz yourself by clicking on tags after you've been able to study these. So that is ciliated simple columnar epithelium. Okay, so now moving on, let's look at some non-ciliated simple columnar very quickly, and then let's go on to the pseudostratified. So clicking here, so this is simple columnar epithelium. You can see the column-shaped cells all touching the basement membrane or the basal membrane. You see these really cool goblet cells stuck in there, and again, they produce mucin or mucus. I'm going to slide myself over here. So let's real quickly go through here. So basal membrane or basement membrane. Here's one of the columnar cells. There are your little goblet cells here. Lamina propria. Lumen of the jejunum. So in this case, this slide was taken from the jejunum, which is part of the small intestine. And the microvilli. So in the intestine, the epithelial layer does not have cilia, but the membranes of the cells have kind of, almost looks like terry cloth. And that increases the absorption, the surface area for absorption of the intestine. And so you can see those little microvilli together called the brush border lining here. So that's pretty cool. So putting on the tags, again, you can just click here. There's lamina propria. There's nucleus of a cell. There's the whole columnar cell. There's a goblet cell. So anyway, you get the idea, so you can play around with that. So now let's take a look at that pseudostratified columnar epithelium, because again, this is the one that usually gives people the most headache. This is ciliated pseudostratified epithelium. And notice you see some nice goblet cells in there that we saw before, but notice that these, while they look columnar, they are all squashed together at some of the bottoms here. So, okay, so there's your cilia on the pseudostratified columnar epithelium, there's a single columnar cell. There are your goblet cells, the lamina propria, and the lumen of the trachea. So in this case, this is one of the few places in the body where you have ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and that is lining the trachea because these cilia are going to be beating out all the dust and the yuckies that you don't want to get into your lungs. So again, what's difficult here is trying to see, why is this not stratified? And again, if you follow a single cell down, you can see that it'll touch that basement membrane there. So you have to kind of follow each one down to the basement membrane. And again, we can tag it. And there's a nucleus of a cell, etc. So I think you get the idea there. Okay, so we've been looking at simple layers. Let's go ahead with the stratified. So let's look at stratified squamous epithelium. And look what you got here. So oftentimes this has a protective function. And so what we're actually looking at here is epidermis, better known as skin. And you'll see here, this is stratified squamous epithelium. So these are flattened cells, and there's just layer after layer after layer, all piling on top of each other. So this is going to be touched on again when you get to the integumentary system. But our skin has many different layers, and the very deep layer here is called the dermis. So that's the dermis. On top of that is the epidermis. Epi means on top of, dermis means skin. And so you can see that the stratified squamous epithelial tissue, you're going to find this in that epidermis. And so you can see that we're dealing with squamous cells. Notice that it highlighted, when I asked it to highlight a squamous cell, it highlighted this one right there. So notice it says without a nucleus. So these are the cells that are getting old. They're starting to die, and as they die, they're going to ascend and become keratinized. And so they lose their nucleus, whereas the ones that do have a nuclei are going to be the younger cells. So this entire thing right here is stratified squamous epithelium. And you'll see that it says keratinized because that means that keratin protein has been secreted as they get older and die, and that makes it tough. So you get calluses on your skin, right? So that's what you're talking about is the keratin that's being produced from the stratified squamous epithelium. So that was stratified squamous epithelium that was keratinized. Let's look at some non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium real quick. And this is a little bit more zoomed in. So you can see these flattened cells here, and you can see how they're all on top of each other, layer after layer after layer, but there's not any of that keratin that we were looking at before. So this is non-keratinized. Here down here is your lamina propria, which is connective tissue. Here's the nucleus of a squamous cell. It's highlighting it right there. Here's the whole squamous cell, and the entire thing is your stratified squamous epithelium. Now let's go look at some stratified cuboidal. So we got over here. So you can see this has what really is 2 layers of cuboidal cells here. But that makes it stratified. So clicking here, here's one of those cuboidal cells. Here's some lumen here. And it turns out this slide is taken from a parotid gland inside your parotid gland. So this is one of those ducts that's lining the duct. And so the inside of the duct is the space out here. That's the lumen. Here's examples of nuclei of these cells. And here's the whole stratified cuboidal epithelium. Let's take a look at some stratified columnar. So here's a slide of stratified columnar epithelium. So you'll see that this is true stratified as opposed to pseudostratified. So these guys are not all touching the basal membrane, and that's why it is actually truly stratified. So there's your basal membrane. Here's a columnar cell. There's your lamina propria, or your connective tissue down there. Here's the lumen, and you'll see it's the lumen of spongy urethra. So we are inside the lining of the urethra here, and that lumen would be the hole or the space inside that tube. And then here's your whole stratified columnar epithelium. Okay, so finally, let's look at some transitional epithelium. Remember, we find this in the bladder. So notice that kind of has almost like a bubbly look at the at the edge here. That's sort of one of my clues that's transitional. But you have your basal membrane here, and these guys right now are kind of in their cuboidal shape, but remember they will be able to change into that flat shape. So here's a capillary going through the connective tissue, and there's that dome-shaped luminal cells of this transitional epithelium. So they kind of have that nice domed but cubey kind of shape. So that's all your connective tissue down there. And here is the space, the lumen, and that whole thing is your transitional epithelium. So remember, with transitional, changes shape. It transitions from one shape of cell to the other. In this case, from cuboidal to squamous and back again. Now let's talk about glands of epithelial tissue. And there's really So now let's talk about the glands of epithelial tissue. And all of these, despite what kind they are, have a secretory function. In other words, they secrete stuff. So it could be mucin, which when combined with water can create mucus. They can secrete hormones and enzymes or even waste products. There's two categories, main categories that we're going to talk about, as well as sweat glands. The two main categories, we have endocrine glands and exocrine glands. And kind of one of the big differences between endocrine and exocrine glands is that endocrine glands have no ducts. They're going to take the stuff that they produce and secrete it directly into the bloodstream or the interstitial fluid, whereas exocrine glands have ducts. And so whatever they secrete from the cells lining that gland, it's going to go into this duct and then be secreted from there. So examples of exocrine glands would be lacrimal glands that produce your tears. Sweat glands is considered a type of exocrine gland, and sebaceous glands that you might find, for example, in your scalp that secrete oil. So you can see a sweat gland is kind of a special type of exocrine gland here with a long duct that will secrete the sweat. And here's some actual photographs of what you're seeing here. So here's an exocrine gland, and you can see the excretory duct right there. So the cells down here are what are called secretory units. They're going to be what does the secreting of the stuff, and then the duct kind of basically transports it into where it's going to be dumped out of. And by the way, you happen to be looking here at pseudostratified epithelium, and then you'll see connective tissue and smooth muscle tissue layers underneath. We'll get to those later. Here's some other photographs showing you exocrine glands. So you can see here is the duct, and you can see stuff will be secreted into the duct up there. Same thing here, and check out all those little goblet cells there that look kind of transparent. They'll be secreting mucin. So we've now gone over epithelial tissue. So let's finish watching some of that animation to recap what we just learned about the classification of epithelial tissue.
Epithelial tissues are classified using two basic criteria: the number of cell layers and the shape of the cell at the apical surface. An epithelium composed of one layer of cells is termed simple. If there are two or more layers of cells, the epithelium is termed stratified. When the apical cells are flat and thin, the epithelium is classified as squamous. Apical cells that are somewhat square-shaped belong to a cuboidal classification, while those with a rectangular shape are termed columnar. By combining the criteria of cell shape and number of layers, all epithelia can be classified easily. For example, a simple squamous epithelium is composed of a single layer of thin, flat cells. In contrast, a stratified squamous epithelium is composed of multiple layers of cells, with the apical surface layer being thin and flat. These same tenets could be applied to cuboidal and columnar epithelia. There are two special types of epithelia. Transitional epithelium, found in the urinary tract, is a stratified epithelium that gives the impression of transitioning from cuboidal when the epithelium is relaxed to squamous when it is stretched. A pseudostratified epithelium, found in the trachea, for example, is a simple epithelium in which all cells contact the basal lamina but only some reach the apical surface. Cells are of varying heights, and their nuclei are at different positions in the epithelium, giving the impression of stratification. Some epithelial classes have specializations of the free surface of apical cells. Simple columnar epithelial cells in some organs have cilia, which are small, finger-like motile projections. Thus, simple columnar epithelium is subclassified as ciliated or non-ciliated. In parts of the digestive and urinary tracts, epithelial cells involved in absorption have a dense collection of short cytoplasmic processes called microvilli on their free surface. Microvilli are non-motile and serve to increase surface area. Because the microvilli appear fuzzy in the light microscope, cells with numerous microvilli are said to have a brush border. A stratified squamous epithelium has either dead or living cells as the surface layer. The dead cells contain the protein keratin. Therefore, stratified squamous epithelium is subclassified as keratinized or non-keratinized. Epithelial cells are tightly connected to adjacent cells by specializations called intercellular junctions. There are 4 types of junctions: tight junctions, adhering junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions. Tight junctions, also known as zonula occludens, are bands of fused cell membrane near the free surface of adjacent epithelial cells. These junctions attach a cell to its neighbors, encircling cells and sealing the space between them. Thus, substances crossing the epithelium must pass through epithelial cells, not between them. Tight junctions are essential to the primary function of an epithelium, which is to regulate substances that enter and leave the body. Adhering junctions, also known as zonula adherens, have a similar band-like arrangement seen in tight junctions. They are located deep to the tight junctions and have numerous microfilament proteins from the cytoplasm that act as anchors for adjacent cells. There is a small gap between the cell membranes of adjacent cells at adhering junctions. Desmosomes, also known as macula adherens, are small button or snap-like junctions. These form at the points of mechanical stress. They are different from tight and adhering junctions in that they do not encircle the entire cell. Gap junctions are points where small pores connect the cytoplasm of adjacent cells. The gap junction consists of a series of hollow bridging structures called connexons. Small solutes, such as ions, glucose, and amino acids, pass through connexons from the cytoplasm of one cell into a neighboring cell.
So we've gone through epithelial tissue, and you learned that there's several categories of epithelial tissue. So hopefully by now you can look at a histology slide and right away tell what kind of epithelial tissue you're looking at. Well, we're now ready to go on to connective tissue. And connective tissue is tissue that connects one structure to another. And that should be no surprise. You might think of something like tendons or ligaments where they're connecting either bone to muscle or bone to bone. So connective tissue connects things to each other. And we can also abbreviate it CT, by the way. And that CT acts as a glue or a filler within the body. So an analogy is you could think of when you're stuffing your turkey at Thanksgiving, you stuff it in there and that really kind of fills things out, gives that turkey its shape that you need. And that's kind of what the connective tissue in our body does. So it either acts as a glue to glue one thing to another, or as a filler to kind of fill up the empty space that's not being occupied by epithelial tissue, for example. So examples of connective tissue in the body, tendons and ligaments, but even adipose tissue, your body fat, is considered a connective tissue, as are your bones, your cartilage, and even blood. So just like there was some complication with the different categories of epithelial tissue, connective tissue, I hate to tell you, but it's can get even more complicated when you're looking at all the categories, the subcategories, and the subcategories of connective tissue. But we're going to try to make it simple. We'll try to break it down so that you can learn all these different types of connective tissue and distinguish one type from another. So let's look at the structural components of connective tissue. Now, different types of connective tissue are going to be composed of different things, but commonly you'll see something like what you see on this diagram here. So crisscrossing all through the connective tissue are proteins, and these proteins are coming in long strings of different thicknesses, and these are called protein fibers. So you can have what are called elastic fibers, which are very thin. You can have collagen fibers, which are a bit thicker. You could have reticular fibers, which are very thin and crisscross each other. So we'll be looking a little more detail of those different kinds of protein fibers later. Now, those fibers are crisscrossing through a bunch of stuff, and we call that stuff ground substance. It's stuff. It has proteins, it has carbohydrates in it, water, salts and other ions, and even certain kinds of cells. For example, this macrophage that you see here, and cells like fibroblasts, which produce some of the ground substance. So all of that stuff put together is what's called the extracellular matrix. So you'll hear this term extracellular matrix used throughout your study of anatomy and physiology. Extra, of course, means outside. So it's the stuff that lies outside of your epithelial layers, your muscle cells or muscle tissue, your nervous tissue. All the extra stuff is your ground substance and those protein fibers, and is the extracellular matrix. So looking at the diagram over here, here are your different types of protein fibers. So elastic, collagen, reticular, and those protein fibers plus all this other stuff, this ground substance, is your extracellular matrix. Here's an actual photograph showing you some of that extracellular matrix. So there's some collagen fibers and some elastic fibers in here. You see different kinds of cells throughout here, and then all this other stuff, this part of the ground substance. So that's kind of a photograph of the diagram that you just saw. But let's now talk about the functions of connective tissue. So we talked about the functions of epithelial tissue. We said it has, for example, a protective function, among other things. Well, so does connective tissue. So connective tissue provides for some physical protection. And again, back to your turkey example there, where you're putting in all that stuffing, that kind of protects one side of the turkey from hitting against the other side, maybe. But extracellular matrix and connective tissue does the same thing. So this is stuffed in between organs, for example. It gives that internal protection. And so when you're bending over, you don't want your liver hitting your intestines, causing friction and trauma. So all that filler, that extracellular stuff, that connective tissue, is going to help to cushion and protect. And of course, as you can see through all these protein fibers, it can give sort of a structural framework to things. And it turns out that one type of connective tissue is bone. And certainly bone is known for its structural support that it gives to the human body. Now, we said that connective tissue can act as a glue, and so it's responsible for the binding of structures. So where one type of connective tissue is connecting a bone to a muscle, or connecting two bones together, for example. Connective tissue can have a storage function. So, for example, in the case of adipose tissue, fat tissue, it's obviously storing fat, which is a way of storing energy. Now, you might not realize it, but connective tissue can have a transport function, especially when you're dealing with blood. So blood is a fluid connective tissue. It's a type of tissue, and we certainly know that blood transports things. So it's transporting hemoglobin, which carries oxygen or carbon dioxide. It's transporting nutrients, all sorts of things. So blood, connective tissue, has a transport function. And then finally, connective tissue can have an immune function because it's going to, well, especially in the case of blood, it's going to transport all sorts of white blood cells which function in immunity. So lymphocytes, like you see there, or macrophages, the Pac-Man cells that go and eat invading things like bacteria. And you saw in the previous diagram, you saw a macrophage sitting there in the ground substance in the extracellular matrix. So you can see that it definitely does have an immune function as well. Now, keeping track of all the different types of connective tissue and their subcategories can be quite the challenge. And this chart right here is an excellent way to try to keep track of these categories and to study them. But we're going to try to break it down and show pictorial examples of each of these. So let's get started. First of all, we can kind of break these down into 4 major categories. So 4 categories of connective tissue that are present after birth. Let's break this down into something called connective tissue proper, CT proper. We're going to break it into a category called supporting connective tissue, of which we're going to break that further. And we're going to have fluid connective tissue. So after we get our original tissue, once it during development, it breaks into 3 categories: connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. Now, the fluid connective tissue is easy to remember because there's only one type, and that is blood. So blood is a connective tissue. The supporting connective tissue, we're going to break into 2 subcategories, and that being cartilage and bone. And we'll talk more in detail about those, and those can be further subdivided. So that's where that gets kind of confusing there. And then connective tissue proper, which we're going to talk about first, we're going to break into what's called loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. And each of those categories has subcategories. So for now, connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, fluid connective tissue are the 3 overarching categories. And then from there, connective tissue proper is loose versus dense, supporting is cartilage versus bone, and fluid is just blood. So let's dive into connective tissue proper and learn all the subcategories and the sub-subcategories. Okay, so we said that connective tissue can be a mix of protein fibers and extracellular material, as we've been talking about. But let's start first talking about connective tissue proper, CT proper. And recall we said we can break that into 2 subcategories: loose connective tissue proper or dense connective tissue proper. Now, when you look at pictures of these, you're going to right away be able to tell the difference between those 2, because loose connective tissue proper is the collagen fibers are very scattered. You're probably going to see some blood vessels and nerves in there. So just everything's not tightly compacted, much looser. And you'll find this in, for example, the upper dermis of the skin. Dense is very easy to spot. It's very dense. It has collagen fibers that are all packed in next to each other. As you can see here, you see very little ground substance. You don't see any blood vessels or nerves. So examples of this would be like tendons or ligaments. And if you've ever eaten a steak and seen the tendons there, you'll know what I'm talking about, kind of that flexible but tough material. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the fibers of the connective tissue proper. So these protein fibers are secreted right into that extracellular matrix. And as you'll recall, we identified collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. So let's look closely at the photograph and the diagram here that illustrate this. So again, elastic fibers are very thin. They're kind of stretchy. Collagen fibers are much thicker. So if you just look here at the difference between the elastic fiber and the collagen fiber, you can right away tell the difference there. And then, of course, you have your ground substance that these fibers are working through. And you'll have cells like these fibroblasts that give rise to all this. So in looking at the diagram, elastic fiber, we have the fibroblast or the cells, and the collagen fiber is much thicker, and then the ground substance is everything behind that. So just to recap that, connective tissue proper can be subdivided into 2 categories: loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. And this chart right here gives a nice little summary, not just of the differences between loose and dense connective tissue proper, but will list their subcategories so you can start learning those. So again, compared to dense, loose connective tissue has relatively fewer cells and fibers than dense connective tissues, and those fibers are just kind of scattered and loosely arranged. Now, we're going to break this loose connective tissue into three subcategories: areolar connective tissue, adipose connective tissue, and reticular connective tissue. So areolar serves to bind and pack organs. It's around the organs. Think of it if you took a package to the UPS and they put the styrofoam peanuts in there. That's your loose areolar connective tissue. Adipose tissue has a protective function as well, but as we know, one of its main functions is to store fat. For one thing, that helps to insulate the organism. And then reticular connective tissue is very meshy. So when you hear the word reticular, it tends to mean a net or a network of stuff. So reticular connective tissue is a bunch of stringy network of fibers all over the place. For example, this is forming the stroma, or the kind of stuff on the inside of lymphatic organs. So really good to take a look at these locations. So you can see that areolar connective tissue you're going to find around nerves and vessels, so kind of forming sort of a nice protective net around those. The adipose tissue, of course, is, fat can be around the kidney, it can be around organs, it can be stored in your subcutaneous layer. Reticular connective tissue, again, spleen, liver, lymph nodes, you'll see it all throughout those kinds of organs. Contrasting that with dense connective tissue, you're going to have higher proportion of fibers compared to the ground substance, so you don't see a lot of ground substance in there, but they're really densely packed together. So we're going to divide those into three subcategories: dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and elastic connective tissue. So dense regular, densely packed collagen fibers, and they tend to go parallel to each other, like that picture I showed you, towards the direction of the stress. Dense irregular, also densely packed, but the fibers can be interwoven, so not necessarily parallel. Elastic is, arranged kind of irregularly. But all of these guys, are going to provide strength of some sort. In the case of dense regular, it's strength and flexibility in one direction, whereas dense irregular is going to be sort of tensile strength in all directions. And elastic connective tissue is going to provide some framework and support the organs. So dense regular, we're talking tendons and ligaments. Dense irregular, you're going to find this in the dermis of the skin and in capsules of organs. And elastic connective tissue, the walls of large arteries. So trying to, keep track of locations where you find these different things is going to really help you later on. But this chart's kind of nice for just separating out the different subcategories in loose versus dense connective tissue proper. So let's take a visual look at some of this loose connective tissue. So we have down here actual micrograph showing adipocytes, so fat cells. And you can see the nucleus of a fat cell is pushed way off towards the side, and most of the cell is filled with fat. So that's an example of some loose connective tissue. This particular layer of fat here is found in the subcutaneous layer of the skin, or called the hypodermis. So adipose tissue, fat tissue, is considered to be a loose connective tissue, is kind of the take-home message here. So another category of loose connective tissue, remember, is reticular connective tissue. And so we said this is found in the stroma of organs that tend to have immune functions. So here's the spleen, and it's found in the stroma, kind of the body of the spleen. So all of these are reticular fibers, which are a kind of loose connective, part of the loose connective tissue. And you'll see that it kind of looks like a network of spider webs. So you got lots of ground substance here. You have some white blood cells, some leukocytes, and then your reticular fibers. So here's the drawing of it, just to make it a little bit clearer. But just in general, you're seeing lots and lots of ground substance, plus these spider-like reticular fibers. So this is reticular connective tissue, one of the subcategories of loose connective tissue. So now we can contrast what we just saw with dense regular connective tissue found in ligaments and tendons. And we showed you this picture before, but again, you can see that these fibers are parallel, very little ground substance being shown. You just see the occasional fibroblast cell in there, but other than that, it's fairly uniform looking. And then we have a dense irregular connective tissue. So dense irregular connective tissue is found in the dermis, so in the reticular layer of the dermis of the skin. And you can see it's all swirly. So as opposed to the dense regular that you just saw, dense irregular is swirly. The collagen fiber bundles are kind of going every which way here. You still see fibroblasts and ground substance, but compared to loose, you're seeing much less ground substance. So bundles of collagen fibers extending in many directions. It's found in the deep portion of the skin, which is the dermis, and in capsules around organs such as the liver, kidney, and spleen. So dense, irregular connective tissue. Now, that third category, the elastic connective tissue of dense connective tissue proper. So taking a look at this, you can just see it looks very different from what you've just been seeing. So still very little ground substance showing, fibroblasts show, but these elastic fibers are very interesting. They don't look like the reticular fibers of the loose connective tissue. These guys are kind of dense. So predominant elastic fibers, and they provide that stretchability and the recoil that's needed in certain organs, especially ones that go under a lot of stress. So we find these in our vocal cords because you're getting that constant vibration of sound going through, and large and medium-sized arteries. So for example, the wall of the aorta is going to have elastic connective tissue. So elastic connective tissue is a subcategory of dense connective tissue. So let's just real quickly recap what we just said about connective tissue proper. So we just finished going over this left side of this chart here. So connective tissue proper broken into two categories, loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Main difference being a lot more ground substance showing in loose compared to dense. And then we said each of these can be subdivided. So loose connective tissue, we had areolar, adipose, and reticular, versus dense was broken into regular, irregular, and elastic. One side of the chart in the bank. So now that we've taken care of that left side of the chart, we've gone over connective tissue proper, broken into loose and dense connective tissue. We can now start going over the rest of the chart. So recall that we had supporting connective tissue that was broken into cartilage tissue and bone tissue, and then we had fluid connective tissue, which was blood. So let's talk about supporting connective tissue. So cartilage tissue, this would be a substance that's going to have the ground substance being kind of semi-solid. So kind of bendable, flexible, not liquid, not solid, somewhere in between, and a bunch of chondrocytes included. So chondrocytes are these little cells that are going to be embedded into that semi-solid ground substance. Now, cartilage, of course, we still have that inside our adult bodies, but during development, your skeleton is all cartilage because it needs to be flexible. Your head has to be able to fit through a birth canal, for example. And that serves as the template so that as the baby ages and turns into a kid, it will be the cartilage will be a lot of times replaced by bone. So that will become a hard skeleton. But we still retain cartilage in our bodies, for example, inside the joints that go between two bones. So that keeps the bones from sliding against each other and hitting each other and breaking. Now, the bone tissue itself is another form of supporting connective tissue. And you can see that if you took a cross section of a long bone, such as your femur in your leg, you would see these circles. And these circles really are tubes. And you see that they have these rings, and those rings are called lamellae. And inside those are little cells called osteoblasts. So we get these concentric circles of calcified layers with osteoblasts, bone cells, embedded in them. And right in the middle of this osteon, as it's called, is sort of a hollow tube that's filled with nerves and blood vessels. So we'll be studying bone in a lot more detail later on, but just to give you an idea of bone tissue versus cartilage tissue, both being the two subcategories of supporting connective tissue. And then, of course, we got blood. Here's a scanning electron micrograph showing you red blood cells going through a vessel. So here shows you some histology, some micrographs of that supporting connective tissue, cartilage, and bone. So you can see here some cartilage. This happens to be something called elastic cartilage, but you see these little spaces. We'll go into details in just a sec, but each one contains a chondrocyte, a cartilage cell. And here are those osteons of bone tissue with the concentric lamellae and then the central canal with the nerve and blood vessels in it. So a little more about cartilage. So this is kind of what a certain kind of cartilage we're going to talk about looks like. And you see just tons of the extracellular matrix here. And then the chondrocytes, the little cartilage cells, and they sit inside a little space here called a lacuna. And here is an example of some of that cartilage between the bone. So this happens to be called articular cartilage, sitting on a bone here. So overall, we can say cartilage has a gel-like extracellular matrix. Again, it's flexible, it's not hard, and it's not soft. It's somewhere in between, and that's important because it has a protective role. The cells of cartilage are called chondrocytes. Chondro refers to cartilage, and cytes means cells. And these cells occupy little spaces in their lacunae. So lacunae for plural or lacuna for singular. And they're just kind of, these lacunae with their chondrocytes are just kind of embedded in this extracellular matrix. So very characteristic, very easy to spot. So let's get started talking about the subcategories of supporting connective tissue. So there are three types: hyaline cartilage, which you see here and here, fibrocartilage, which you'll see in a subsequent slide, and elastic cartilage. So let's get started first with hyaline cartilage. Now, hyaline cartilage, as you can see from these pictures here, has a ton of extracellular matrix in it. So you have little cells called chondrocytes, and they're found in these little holes called lacunae, but they are few and far between because you have that extracellular matrix all through them. So you find hyaline cartilage in a fetal skeleton, and in adults, you find it at the ends of bones, in your trachea, and your larynx, and your nose. So you can see that it's weak. That makes it very flexible, right? So we have flexible hyaline cartilage. It's the most common type of cartilage in the body. So when in doubt, good bet it's hyaline cartilage. But there's two other types, fibrocartilage and elastic cartilage, that we're going to go over now. Now, the second type of supporting connective tissue cartilage is fibrocartilage. You can see this looks a lot different from the hyaline cartilage. So it has these waves of collagen fibers in it. So you get this little waviness of collagen fibers, and that's really the telltale sign that you're looking at fibrocartilage. Think of fibrous cartilage, fibrocartilage. It has fibers in it. And so you find this, for example, in the intervertebral discs between your vertebrae, the pubic symphysis, this little bit of cartilage connecting the two sides of the pubic bone, and the menisci of the knee. So here's three different pictures of fibrocartilage, so you can get a sense of what it looks like. And of course, we'll go back and practice these with AP Revealed. In general, the main function of fibrocartilage is to be a shock absorber. So you can see that, right? The menisci of your knee, that's going to be an important place to be able to absorb shock. Same thing with the cartilage between your vertebrae, right? You're constantly, for jumping or doing something, you're getting that pressure. You need something to cushion between those bones. And so fibrocartilage is it. Now, the third type of cartilage is called elastic cartilage. And this one's pretty easy to keep track of. Number one, it looks very different from the hyaline and from the fibrocartilage. You can see the lacunae are all packed together here. And they have these elastic fibers. But the other way to keep track of it is that it's only found in two places in the human body. And both of those places start with an E. So elastic cartilage, epiglottis, external ear. So if you can remember the E's, that elastic cartilage is only found in two places in the body, and they both start with E, the epiglottis and the external ear. Okay, so we've gone through the cartilage part of supporting connective tissue. Let's now go over to bone. And bone itself can be broken into two categories, compact bone and spongy bone. So the compact bone is what I've been showing you, where you do a cross section. So if this is, say, a cross section of a long bone like a femur, so you have your femur here. We said it's made of these osteons, which are really long tubes, and if you cross section them, you get these concentric rings called lamellae, and in the middle is a central canal with blood vessels and nerves. Well, you can see that a compact bone is indeed compact. So here's a scanning electron micrograph showing you, and of course you have the osteoblast cells in these little holes here, these little lacunae. So it's very compact together, versus spongy bone is what you would find on the inside of the bone, of a long bone, for example, and you'll see these little connections here called trabeculae. So there would be a micrograph of it. Here's a scanning electron micrograph of it. And then, of course, your bone is going to have, blood vessels going through that central canal and nerves. Here's a blown up osteocyte coming from out there. And so notice that your compact bone's there on the outside, and then on the inside would be that spongy bone. So thus far, we've talked about connective tissue proper, loose and dense, and then their subcategories from there. We talked about supporting connective tissue, which was the cartilage with its three categories, and bone with its two categories. Now we're on the very far right of that chart. We're at the end, and that is fluid connective tissue, of which there is only one kind, and that is blood. So here's some red blood cells here. Here's a regular light microscope micrograph of blood. So we see our red blood cells. Here's a lymphocyte, which is a kind of white blood cell. Here's a neutrophil, which is another kind of white blood cell. Now, blood itself, again, it has a function of transport, and it's composed of three components. So most of it is going to be plasma. Plasma is ground substance and protein fibers, but it's very watery. So that is where your extracellular matrix is in blood connective tissue, and that is the plasma. Another name for red blood cells are erythrocytes. Erythro means red, and cytes means cells. So we have erythrocytes. And then you also are going to have different types of leukocytes, which are your white blood cells. Leuko means white. And then in addition to your erythrocytes and your leukocytes, you're going to have platelets. And so these are little fragments of blood cells, and they're very important. They play an important role in the clotting of blood. So that's your fluid connective tissue, blood. So that fills out our entire chart on connective tissue. We've looked at our connective tissue proper, loose versus dense, and there's subcategories there. We have our supporting connective tissue. That was the cartilage and the bone, of which there were three types of cartilage and two types of bone, and the fluid connective tissue, the blood. So let's do one more overview of the chart, and then we're going to go to our AP Revealed software and sum it all up. So we have gone through this entire connective tissue classification chart now. We learned there was connective tissue proper, and it was broken into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Of the loose connective tissue, there were three subcategories. So we had areolar, adipose, and reticular. And the dense connective tissue, we had regular, irregular, and elastic. Then we moved on to supporting connective tissue, of which we divided that into cartilage versus bone. We said cartilage, there are three types: hyaline, fibrocartilage, and elastic. And bone, there was compact and spongy bone. Now, a place where students often get confused is that dense connective tissue, which is a kind of connective tissue proper, has elastic connective tissue proper as one of its subcategories. And cartilage also has an elastic type subcategory. So try to keep those straight. They both have the same name, but one is for cartilage and one is for dense connective tissue proper. So let's go ahead and take this over to AP Revealed. So we're going to go back to the tissues module. And let's start off with the animations again, except this time we're going to go to the connective tissue overview and recap what we just learned about the different categories of connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue.
Connective tissue is diverse, abundant, and widely distributed through the body. Its primary functions include structural support, binding structures together, fat storage, exchange of nutrients and metabolic waste, and defense and protection. All connective tissues share three basic components: cells, protein fibers, and ground substance. Together, the protein fibers and ground substance form the extracellular matrix. The proportions of these components, in addition to different cells and protein fibers, help define the various categories of connective tissue. In the adult, connective tissue can be divided into three broad categories: connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. There are two basic subcategories of connective tissue proper: loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Loose connective tissue has abundant ground substance with scattered cells and loosely arranged protein fibers. By comparison, dense connective tissue has abundant, tightly packed fibers but relatively few cells and little ground substance. Loose connective tissue can be subdivided into areolar, adipose, and reticular connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue is found in the subcutaneous layer and around organs. It has a gel-like ground substance, numerous blood vessels, and scattered cells known as fibroblasts. Adipose connective tissue is found in subcutaneous tissue and around some organs. It is composed of closely packed adipocytes or fat cells. Reticular connective tissue forms the stroma, a connective tissue framework, of lymph nodes, the spleen, the thymus, and bone marrow. It is composed of a network of branched collagen fibers, known as reticular fibers, with scattered fibroblasts and leukocytes, or white blood cells, embedded in a gel-like ground substance. Dense connective tissue can be subdivided into dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic connective tissue. Dense regular connective tissue forms tendons and most ligaments. It is composed of densely packed, parallel collagen fibers with fibroblasts between the layers. There is little ground substance. Dense, irregular connective tissue is found in the dermis, periosteum and perichondrium, and the capsule of organs. This type of connective tissue is composed predominantly of randomly arranged collagen fibers with fibroblasts interspersed. There is more ground substance than found in dense, regular connective tissue. Elastic tissue is found in the walls of elastic arteries, the trachea and bronchi, and the vocal cords. This type of connective tissue is composed predominantly of branching elastic fibers, with fibroblasts in some spaces between the fibers. Elastic fibers, formed by the protein elastin, stretch under tension and then return to their original shape when tension is released. Supporting connective tissue can be subdivided into cartilage and bone. Cartilage has a semi-solid extracellular matrix that allows flexibility, whereas the solid matrix of bone is more rigid and provides greater support. There are three types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most common type. It is found on the articular surfaces of synovial joints. It also forms the cartilage of the larynx, trachea, and nose. Chondrocytes, or mature cartilage cells, are found within small spaces called lacunae that are scattered irregularly in the extracellular matrix. Collagen fibrils are present within the matrix, but not visible in the light microscope. A perichondrium, a dense, irregular connective tissue sheath, overlies most cartilage. Elastic cartilage is found in the external ear and in the epiglottis. It contains abundant elastic fibers, which form a web-like mesh around lacunae that contain chondrocytes. Like hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage usually has a perichondrium. Fibrocartilage is found in intervertebral discs, the pubic symphysis, and the menisci of the knee joint. It contains numerous irregular bundles of collagen fibers. The sparse ground substance contains chondrocytes within lacunae that are frequently arranged in parallel rows. Unlike hyaline and elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage does not have a perichondrium. There are two forms of bone or osseous connective tissue: compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone usually forms the hard outer shell of bones. Concentric rings of bone, called lamellae, form cylindrical structures known as osteons. Each osteon has a central canal that connects to a network of tiny branching passageways called canaliculi. The central canal and canaliculi contain blood vessels. Osteocytes, or mature bone cells, occupy lacunae, small spaces, between neighboring lamellae. Spongy bone, also known as cancellous bone, usually forms inside of bones. It does not contain osteons. Slender bony plates, called trabeculae, form a bony network. The spaces between trabeculae contain bone marrow and blood vessels. Osteocytes are scattered throughout the trabeculae. The combination of compact and spongy bone allows bones to be both strong and lightweight. Fluid connective tissue is represented by blood. The formed elements of blood, specifically its cells and cell fragments, include erythrocytes, or red blood cells, leukocytes, or white blood cells, and platelets. The watery ground substance of blood contains dissolved protein fibers.
Okay, hopefully that helped you to do a review and keep track of that chart so that you can learn all the different kinds of connective tissue in the body. Let's do a quick review of some pictures of some histology of different kinds of connective tissue just to test and see if you're able to keep them straight. So we're going to go down here to connective tissue. Let's go ahead and start with connective tissue proper. So over here, we have areolar connective tissue, and you can click on the different parts here. So, you have some nuclei of endothelial cells and nuclei of fibroblasts. There's all the ground substance right there, what looks like open space, it's ground substance, elastic fibers, and your collagen fibers there. And again, you can always hit the tags to quiz yourself, and get more information on it. So I encourage you to go through all of this so that you can study that. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Okay, so let's move on to adipose tissue. It's very characteristic because you see these just open areas which look like empty space, and really it's filled with lipids, with fat. The membrane of the cell is just, because of all the fat, it's been pushed off to the side, so the nucleus of the cell is also pushed off to the side. So we can say, okay, there is our adipocytes, our adipose tissue. We got some capillaries sticking there. And there is the lipid inclusion, which is just all the fat inside of those adipocytes. And then the nuclei of the adipocytes are stuck way over to the side there. Okay. Let's go ahead and look at the last subcategory of connective tissue proper. So remember, this is loose connective tissue proper that we've just been looking at. So loose connective tissue proper is broken down to areolar, adipose, and now we're going to look at the last subcategory, the reticular connective tissue. And so remember with this, it looks like there's dark spider webs going everywhere. So this is often found in organs that are associated with immunity, such as the spleen and in the lymph nodes. And so here you're going to see quite a bit of leukocytes and macrophages because, again, this is associated with things that are associated with immunity. So you'll see white blood cells in there, and then the telltale sign is that spider web-like reticular fibers that you see there. Let's go on down, and so we've closed out loose connective tissue proper, which had areolar, adipose, and reticular. Let's go on down to dense connective tissue proper, very characteristic. So again, you're seeing these parallel, tightly packed fibers there. So these are collagen fibers. All of that stuff is collagen fibers. Very little ground substance. You see a little bit peeking through, but nothing compared to loose connective tissue proper. And then you'll see the fibroblasts and their nuclei going through the substance. So that's dense connective tissue, dense regular connective tissue proper. So remember, there's dense regular, and then we're about to look at dense irregular. So contrast this dense regular to dense irregular. Quite a difference there. Notice this stuff is all over the place. The collagen fibers are not parallel. They are going swishy, swishy. It kind of looks like a Picasso painting. Or maybe a Van Gogh painting, I guess. So these are the collagen fibers in dense irregular connective tissue. They're just everywhere, going every which way. Some more ground substance showing than you saw in dense regular, but still nothing compared to what you see in loose. And you have your fibroblasts and their nuclei over there. Finally, so we went through dense regular, dense irregular, and now the last subcategory of connective tissue proper that is dense is elastic connective tissue. Very characteristic because you tend to have these really dark elastic fibers there. And recall, this is only found in the external ear or the epiglottis. So here are elastic lamellae, as they're called. The endothelium is up there. The internal elastic lamella. So there's different parts here, but, really I just want you to get a look for what this dense connective tissue proper looks like when it's elastic, because you have these elastic fibers going all through there. Okay, let's take a look at cartilage. So let's start off with that hyaline cartilage. Again, a ton of extracellular matrix, and then you have your chondrocytes in their lacunae. So here are your chondrocytes in the lacunae. Here's all your extracellular matrix. You have each one of these is a lacuna. There's the nuclei of the chondrocytes. And then surrounding all this, you have this perichondrium that was discussed in the video. So that's hyaline. Let's go on down to fibrocartilage. Very characteristic because of the wavy fibers. Here are the little chondrocytes inside their lacunae. Here are the collagen fibers themselves. The ground substance, there's a lacuna, and then the nuclei of the chondrocytes. So these are structures you should know if you're shown one of these slides. And finally, elastic cartilage. So keep in mind, there is elastic cartilage under the supporting cartilage, and there's elastic connective tissue under the dense connective tissue proper. So try to keep those straight. This elastic cartilage, again, the lacunae are super close together, and then you see those dark fibers going through there. So there are all your chondrocytes and their lacunae. There are those elastic fibers, and not very much ground substance showing. There's all your lacunae, the nuclei of the chondrocytes, and this one also has that perichondrium surrounding it. Finally, almost finally, onto bone. Let's look at compact bone here. So there are your little osteons over here, the central canals of the osteons, the interstitial lamellae as they're called, sort of surrounding the osteons, the little osteocyte bone cells inside the lacunae, and then one of these would be a whole osteon right here. Okay, so that's compact bone. Contrast that with spongy bone. So spongy bone, much different. We have the marrow going on here. So all that is bone marrow. And then the little bony structures, which are called beams, which mean beams here, are the trabeculae. The trabeculae is part of the bone, and the compact bone would be the stronger part on the outside of that. And finally, we have blood. And blood will show your blood cells, the little platelets, and the white blood cells. So there are your red blood cells, the erythrocytes. There are your leukocytes, of which there are different kinds you'll learn about later, and the platelets. All right. So that does it for connective tissue. All right, hopefully you've been able to keep all of that straight in your brain. So we've talked about epithelial tissue in all the categories, and then we talked about connective tissue in all the categories. Well, the good news is the worst part is over. We're going to go over muscle tissue and nervous tissue, and this is pretty quick, not too many subcategories to keep track of. So muscle tissue, there's 3 types in the human body. So we have skeletal muscle tissue, cardiac or heart muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue. So you'll get into more detail about this later when you learn about the muscular system, but to just give an overview, as this is a type of tissue, skeletal muscle is the muscle that is voluntary. It's under our control. So flexing your biceps, walking your legs, turning your head, or moving your mouth, that's all skeletal muscle tissue, and we can control it with our conscious brain. But when you're looking at it under a microscope, it's easy to keep track of because it has striations. It has stripes. So you'll see these kinds of rows of muscle fibers with these striated areas here. And then you'll also see nuclei of the muscle cells here, kind of almost sort of lined up. So that's skeletal muscle. Contrast that with cardiac muscle, heart muscle. You don't see much striation. It's there, but it's much lighter than it is in the skeletal muscle. What really is the telltale sign that you're looking at cardiac muscle are these intercalated discs that you find between the cells. So if you see intercalated discs and the cell itself is kind of Y-shaped, it's sort of hard to see here. But these intercalated discs allow for communication between cardiac cells. So they allow for sodium exchange. Now, cardiac muscle is not under our conscious control. We can't control our heart muscle by thinking about it, so it's involuntary. And then the other type of muscle tissue that is involuntary is smooth muscle. So this would be the muscle that lines the walls of our organs, such as your digestive, urinary, and reproductive systems, the bronchioles of your lungs, the walls of your veins and arteries. So it is not under conscious control. And unlike both skeletal and cardiac, it is not at all striated. So it does not have any stripes or striations. It is smooth. Now you will be able to see the nuclei of cells there. Okay, so now that you have been introduced into the histology of muscle tissue, let's go ahead and look at some of the pictures of this in our McGraw-Hill AP Revealed software. So I've clicked on the microscope up here, and for topics, I'm going to go ahead and go down to skeletal muscle. So we can take a look at that. And right away, you see those striations. That should tell you skeletal muscle. So now there are different bands to this. You'll learn more about this when we study the muscular system. But if you wanted to get a jump start and say, where's the A band? So all those in between what looks pink there is the A band. And then the I band would be the other ones. But what's really interesting to see here is that you can see the nuclei of these skeletal muscle fibers just kind of lined up between the fibers. So if you see that and you see these striations, right away you know skeletal muscle. Now let's go ahead and contrast that with cardiac muscle. And you can see here, if you look closely, these little lines, those are your intercalated discs. So let's highlight the intercalated discs there. So you can see all of those. You can see the branched cardiac muscle fiber. So you can see it has kind of a Y shape to it. That's another telltale sign. Now there are striations in cardiac muscle, but under a regular light microscope, they're kind of hard to see. So if they're obvious, think skeletal muscle. If the intercalated discs are there, think cardiac muscle. And then you can see the nuclei of the cardiac muscle fibers there. And then finally, let's look at smooth muscle. And you can see that Okay, so let's go ahead and look at smooth muscle, and here it's giving us an option of low and high magnification. So let's start with low magnification, and we can see it looks smooth. There's no striations there. So this is a longitudinal section of it. And so each one of these would be a smooth muscle fiber. You can see the nucleus of each one. Let's see what it looks like under high magnification. So looking up close, again, no striations. You can see the nucleus of each little fiber very well. So there's the nucleus of the muscle fiber, and there are the smooth muscle fibers. So that is muscle histology. Okay, and last but not least, in our exploration of tissues of the human body, we have nervous tissue. So nervous tissue, of course, is used to pass signals around in our body, maybe from our brain to our spinal cord, or a spinal cord to a muscle. But when you're talking about the histology of it, we're going to be looking at a single neuron, for example. And so this right here would be a neuron. Here's a diagram of a neuron. Again, its function is to conduct impulses. It's found in the brain, the spinal cord, and nerves. Now, if we look at the different components of it, it's very interesting. So the main part of a neuron is called the cell body. That's the metabolic center. It's where all the organelles are located, such as the mitochondria. You can see a nucleus right there. And then you have projections. So you have kind of shorter projections. These are called dendrites. They're the ones that receive electrical signals, maybe from another neuron. And you have an axon, which is a much longer projection, and it sends the signal from the body of the neuron. So you'll get into this more when you study the nervous system, but let's go check it out on AP Revealed. Okay, we're back in our McGraw-Hill Publishers AP Revealed software, and let's watch a little video clip that's going to go over the nervous system tissue, nervous tissue. And this is going to introduce you to some other aspects of nervous tissue that I didn't mention before. So this is a good one to watch. And then we're going to look at the histology, and we will be done with tissues.
The nervous system is a network of specialized cells that monitors the internal and external environment, processes information, and initiates commands through which the body reacts. Nervous tissue is composed of two types of cells: neurons, or nerve cells, and glial cells. A neuron, the basic functional unit of the nervous system, is specialized to conduct electrical impulses. Neurons have several important functional properties: a high metabolic rate, most are incapable of cell division, and they typically function throughout life. The size and shape of neurons is variable, but they share basic features. The cell body, or soma, receives, integrates, and sends nerve impulses. It typically contains a large nucleus that often has a prominent nucleolus. Ribosomes are abundant and form clusters known as chromatophilic substance, or Nissl bodies, that stain darkly with basic histological dyes. Two types of processes project from the cell body: axons and dendrites. Axons direct information away from the cell body. Most neurons have a single, long, thin axon connected to the cell body at a region known as the axon hillock. The axon generally does not branch, but it may have occasional side branches called collaterals. Most axons terminate as multiple fine branches called telodendria. These have distal expansions known as synaptic knobs, also called end bulbs or terminal boutons. Dendrites direct information toward the cell body. They are relatively short, tapered processes that branch along their length. They often possess small, irregular projections called dendritic spines, where axons can synapse. A synapse is where information is transferred between nerve cells, or to an effector cell, or to a sensory receptor cell. Glial cells, which are also known as neuroglia, are support cells that represent about 60% of cells in the nervous system. 4 types of glial cells are found in the central nervous system, or CNS: astrocytes, ependymal cells, microglia, and oligodendrocytes. Two additional types of glial cells are found in the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, Schwann cells, and satellite cells. Astrocytes are the most abundant type of glial cell in the CNS. They are star-shaped, with numerous branching processes whose expanded ends contact and support neurons. In some astrocytes, these processes contact capillaries as peravascular feet that help form a blood-brain barrier. This regulates the passage of substances between the CNS and bloodstream. Other important astrocyte functions include regulation of the chemical environment and promotion of neuronal development. Unlike neurons, astrocytes are capable of cell division and can replace dying neurons with a glial scar. Ependymal cells are epithelial cells that line the ventricles of the brain and central canal of the spinal cord. They play an important role in the production and circulation of cerebrospinal fluid.
So you see right here a beautiful neuron, and see if before we even click on it, can you identify some of the parts? So you had your body of the neuron here with the nucleus and even a nucleolus showing. You got dendrites and an axon. So let's click on it. So if I click here, there is your axon. Notice it's the longest part. It's going to send the signals down. We have our smaller dendrites that receive signals. Here's your entire neuron. This right here is something called a Nissi substance, and worry about that when you get to the nervous system. There's your nucleolus, and you also have the nucleus of what are called glial cells, which are support cells of the nervous system. And then one more, there's your nucleus. So that's your neuron. That's a typical histological picture of a neuron. And that concludes our study of tissues of the human body. So we've gone over epithelial tissues, we've gone over connective tissues, and we've gone over muscle tissues and nervous tissues. So I hope you're able to keep everything straight. Take care.